Got a Karjakin white playing for Malachit. Kamsky black playing for Rook. Okay. So, we'll take a look at the opening and see. Kamsky is known for playing kind of speculative openings. And against Karjakin, it was no exception. He chose to play this line. So it's a modern. Okay, Karjakin's developing fairly naturally. F4, aggressive. This is a pseudo-Austrian attack. Okay, knight f3, b5. So black's idea is he just kind of wants to stake a claim out on the queen side very quickly. So Karjakin continues developing. So does Kamsky. e5, trying to keep a knight out of f6. c5. And now bishop e4, attacking the rook. Rook b8. Okay, so all of this has been played before. All of this had been played before. Now, the question is, what should white do here? And actually, in this position, several things have been tried. You guys try to guess some possible moves for white here? This system is actually known as Tiger's modern system because its most popular practitioner is Tiger Hillarp Person. He actually wrote a book about this called Tiger's Modern. So yeah, his first name is Tiger, and he plays the modern in this fashion. And so it's called Tiger's Modern. He's had quite a few games on the black side of this. So Kamsky chose to employ this line. And so what? What should white do here? What should white do here? So the most common moves here have been in order to castle, to play bishop e3, to play d takes c5, play knight to g5, to play e6, and in one game actually, white actually took on d6. Okay, so I'm pretty sure either castling or bishop e3 is correct. But white chose a move that has actually never been played before. And that move is knight e2. So it's a little odd, you know, moving this knight before being provoked to do so by a push of b4. Notice how this bishop is not really sure how it's getting out yet, because all of white's pawns in the center are on dark squares. But white has a lead in development, and it's going to take black a couple of moves to get castled. But okay, so black plays knight h6, getting ready to castle. And again here, white can castle, of course, but he plays c3, just trying to support this pawn. But notice how he's making this bishop worse in a way. Not really giving a chance for the bishop to go out that way. And so Kamsky captures on d4. Okay, so the question is how to recapture. There's actually 4 choices. You can take with the e knight, you can take with the f knight, you can take with the pawn, or you can take with the queen. What do you guys think white should take with? What do you guys think white should take with? You have 4 choices. So it seems most natural to take with a knight. The idea being that that when you take with a knight, you threaten knight to c6, which forks the queen and the rook. So after knight to e takes d4, say, this knight is the worst placed of the two, because this knight is helping to defend this square. And bishop b7, and take, and white's doing quite well here, probably after the move, like e6, for example. So that seems good. Notice how black can't really play queen c7, because again, e6 is he's doing quite well here. Black can't capture because of this fork. So this e6 move is always a dangerous move for black to try to look out for, but instead of taking with the knight, white actually took back with a pawn. Okay, now he's opening this c3 square again for his knight, but notice how his pawn structure now is making it so his bishop is not really that great. Whereas when he takes with the knight, okay, his bishop has a natural square on e3 to kind of land on. Okay. So now, of course, black is a little bit worried about potential ideas of e6, so he plays e6 himself. And then white castles. Black plays queen b6. So putting pressure on this d4 pawn. And now white has a couple of choices here. White can maybe play a move like bishop d2, followed by queen e1, and kind of get some pressure on this diagonal. And then natural move to follow would be a move like rook c1 and just get his pieces onto the c file. So that makes sense. Another idea he can play is maybe try to weaken the queen side. He can try to start going like a4. And then if black decides to take, he can put pressure on this a6 pawn. Because inevitably black will have to play a move like bishop to b7 to trade off the bishops. And then this pawn on a6 becomes a little bit weaker. Another idea is he can simply play queen e1 just to kind of have the queen look at both this diagonal and this diagonal, and not necessarily play bishop d2. So white has a few choices, but white chooses to play this move h3, which is a little odd because it's not like this knight's really coming to g4 anyway. It's probably going to come into f5. So it seems like a little bit of a waste of time. And indeed, black does play knight f5. Okay. So now white decides to get his king out of the way, king h2. Black plays bishop to b7. Like I said, the exchange of these bishops is inevitable. And notice how now that once these bishops get exchanged, black can feel more comfortable about putting his pawns on light squares because he's gotten rid of his bad bishop. So notice that this bishop is still technically black's bad bishop because the pawns in the center are going to be mostly on light squares. So this is actually black's good bishop, even though it's kind of not doing so much hitting e5 at the moment. So, okay, take. And now, what do you guys think white should maybe do here? So, you know, he's ahead in development, but, you know, black's going to castle very quickly. He doesn't really have a good place for this bishop. It's not clear what he exactly wants to do in the center. He probably doesn't want to move this pawn ever because it just weakens this guy and gives this knight hopping squares. His light squares are weak. But what should maybe white try to do in this position? Any ideas? Yeah, very good. Very good. So yeah, the two ideas here would be to either play a4, again, trying to create a weakness on a6, or on b5, and just kind of open up a line for his rook. Or the other idea would be to play a move like g4 and chase this knight away. before undertaking further operations. Because ideally what white wants to do is to sink a knight into e4. And then from e4, this knight can kind of look on these key squares. Because this pawn on e5 is doing a good job of controlling the dark squares. So white needs knights on the light squares to help control the dark squares. Because remember, a knight controls the opposite color of the square it's standing on. So both moves are reasonable. Karjakin sought to get rid of this knight, but through through a less committal method, and he instead chose to play knight to g3. So it looks kind of weird that if black captures, white's king is going to be on g3, but notice the center is fairly blocked up, and so the king on g3 isn't exactly exploitable. But it seems a bit odd that he'd be willing to trade these knights, especially when that knight probably wants to, head for e4 at some point. So black makes the exchange. White takes with the king because he has to. And notice how black isn't really worried about castling. Black could have castled any one of these 4 or 5 previous moves, but you notice since the center is locked up, he doesn't really have to rush, and he can, improve the placement of his pieces. So he notices that one of his pieces that needs better placing is this knight, because right now it's not really doing much. So where's a better location for the knight? Well, obviously the light squares, considering white's weakness on those squares. So how does he reposition it? Well, he wants to bring his knight here and potentially either here or here. So he plays knight to b6, very logical. Queen to e2, so he's trying to connect his rooks. Finally, black decides to castle. So because of some strange choices by white, I think black is pretty much equal here. Maybe even slightly better. But white still has more space. The pawn structure is symmetrical, so not too much is going on. Okay. So here, probably white should do something like maybe bishop to d2 or bishop to e3, just develop. But he chooses to try to get a knight into e4. The other idea I was mentioning by playing knight to g5. So his idea now is he wants to get his knight into e4. Yeah, so exposing his king again is not really an issue at all because of the closed center. And his king can always come back to h2. Okay, so now black has some choices. Black can hop his own knight into d5, or even hop his queen into d5 if he wants. Just kind of block it up. But he chooses to capture on e5 first. And so white recaptures with the d pawn. Don't want to recapture with this f pawn. This opens up the position too much. You need to keep it locked down, because now notice how weak this pawn is. So the chances you get by opening this f file are not enough compared to the fact that you're just making this d pawn weak. And also now your king is relatively less safe. So he plays d takes, which is correct. And now black gets knight to d5. Bishop d2, kind of making sure this knight doesn't really have any future. And now, what's the most important file to control here, guys? What's the most important file? Well, you got two choices. It would either be the C file or the D file. But notice how your knight is kind of anchored on this D file. So the most important file is the C file. So what does Kamsky do? Well, he plays rook f8, of course. He just simply intends to infiltrate along the C file. And notice that black's kind of in better position to do this than white. So, of course, Karjakin has to challenge the C file. He can't allow this rook to get to the 7th rank. So this makes sense. Okay, so now what does black do here? Do you guys have any idea? What does black do here? So you have to ask yourself, what pieces of mine can I improve? And so, okay, this knight is pretty much on its optimal square. Not really looking to improve that. This queen is actually well posted because it helps control the c-file, and it's also on a light square, which means it can potentially have access to this diagonal. This rook is helping to defend this rook. So ideally you'd like to double rooks, but you can't really, because as soon as this rook moves, so for example, if rook takes, and now all of a sudden white controls the file. So you're happy with the tension, and really this rook has nowhere else to go. And your king is pretty safe. So what piece have I left out? This guy. So where should it go? Well, it's kind of looking silly attacking this pawn. So let's reroute it. And so bishop f8 makes a lot of sense. Simply threatening to maybe play bishop e7, try to exchange it for this knight, maybe. Notice that on e7 it's better than on h6, for example. Because say he played bishop h6, white could always go knight e4 here. Now threatening knight d6. Whereas when the bishop's on e7, it controls this knight completely. Because of the geometry of the bishop versus the knight. So that's why he wants to bring it, wants to bring it this way. So bishop f8, knight e4, and now bishop e7. Makes sense. And now Karjakin probably should realize that, okay, so now Karjakin should probably ask himself the same question and say, what is my worst placed piece? And this knight is doing quite well on e4. This is kind of like the ultimate square for the knight because it's always threatening to hop into various locations. A knight d6 doesn't do anything immediately. This bishop's actually doing something important. It's kind of corralling this knight on d5, so it can't really go anywhere. It's also protecting f4. This queen is well posted. It's kind of looking out on this knight, looking out this way potentially, also looking out this way. This rook is helping to control this rook, control the c-file. This rook is helping to defend this rook. So I've mentioned every piece but one. Which piece haven't I mentioned? Well, this one's a little trickier, but the piece I haven't mentioned is actually this guy. And so maybe a king to h2 makes sense. Because in some variations, this king on g3 could actually pose an issue. And so now that kind of white's finished putting his pieces where they want to be, now maybe it's time to play king h2. And now you open this g pawn up to potentially either play g3 and help support this, or maybe even in some instances you want to play g4 and gain space and try to mount a kingside attack. The chances are remote, but depending on how black places his pieces, especially in an endgame, you might want to play g4 just to kind of gain space. And a move like king f2, of course, is way too dangerous. It's way out in the open. So king h2 would probably be the most prudent choice. But Karjakin chooses to try to infiltrate on the dark squares a little bit more with his bishop, with bishop to e3. But now, after rook takes c1, rook takes c1, rook c8, now he has a bit of an issue, because ideally, if his bishop were on d2, he would like to play a move like, rook to c2, and then try to double with queen d1, queen c1. But the problem is now this bishop is hanging. So he has to give up the file, unfortunately. Probably relatively better would be to take, check, and then maybe to play king f3. And okay, now you're in an endgame. And notice that even though this queen controls this file, notice that this square is covered, this square is covered, this square is covered, this square is covered, and this square is covered. So even though black controls the file, he actually has no infiltration points. And so this is most probably headed for a draw. But black is slightly better because, his pieces are kind of better than white's. Notice that this knight and this knight are about the same. Black's queen is better though, and this bishop is better than this bishop because these pawns are on dark squares. But again, it's 6 on 6, 2 on 2, and 4 on 4. So this was probably what white should have tried. Another thing he could have done actually is maybe try to play bishop c5 here, and then try to just plant a piece on this square. Maybe support it eventually with a b4 a3 idea. But this could also lead to potentially making the light squares even weaker than they are. Because now maybe this knight can hop into c4. Maybe go like knight b6, knight c4 at some point. But okay. He instead played a rook to d1. So he says, okay, well, if you're going to get the c file, I'll get the d file. So Kamsky, of course, is going to double on the c file. It makes sense. So he plays rook c4 and queen c7. So now he's ready to kind of infiltrate with his rook onto c2. So black is definitely making progress. White chases the rook away. Black gets to the 7th. White defends. And now, which rook is better? Black rook or the white rook? Well, this white rook is kind of just stuck defending the second rank. This black rook is doing an awesome job of controlling the c file. So do you want to trade these rooks? Probably not. Probably not. So Kamsky chooses to just play rook c1 and now control the 8th rank. And Karjakin realizes his position's inferior. So he says, okay, well, let's repeat. I'll offer you a rook trade again. Do you want it? Yes or no? Okay, but the difference here now is that this rook is actually defended. Notice that in this position, rook takes rook was a threat. But in this position, notice that if you take, I can take back with the queen, and my queen is actually doing something on the c1 square. It's actually hitting f4. So in this position, white or black didn't mind as much, and so played this move f5. Very tricky move. Very tricky move. Notice that the cute en passant leads to actually checkmate.
Checkmate.
That is checkmate. So tactically it works, but it also works positionally because it chases away this knight. So now Karjakin is forced to move this knight back, so he plays knight f2. Not really what he wanted to do. Okay, now I have a question for you guys. Can you guys spot the 2600 level chess tempo tactic here? Black has a beautiful, beautiful tactic here. Can you guys spot it? This is a very, very, very fine tactic. And Gata is probably one of the world's best at spotting these types of tactics. So can you guys spot a tactic here? It's very, very pretty. Very pretty. Okay, you guys have to give me a whole line because, I mean, saying one move doesn't prove that you see the tactic. So. The geometry of everything works just so. It works just so. Okay. So let's see exactly how this works. Let's see exactly how this works. Okay, this is tricky now. So black starts with this move, bishop to h4.
Check.
Okay. So white's pretty much forced to take. No real options here. If king h2, I can basically do what happened in the game, but you don't even have a piece for it. So okay, you gotta take. And now this knight takes f4 idea. So the idea is, okay, if you take my rook, I can always play a check and then take your queen. So if you take the rook, I can move my queen out of danger with check, and then I can take on e2. So you can't take my rook, so you have to move your queen. And the problem is there aren't too many squares where this queen can go where you're actually holding on to this rook on d1. So queen f3, for example. And now the beauty of the problem is that black has queen d8 check.
Check.
So the king only has one legal move, king g3, and now rook takes d1. Now rook takes d1, because after queen takes d1, there's queen takes d4. And after queen takes d4, there's knight e2. And black wins a pawn through all of this. So the real key is that at the end, the king and the queen are forked on e2. And so black wins a pawn and gets into a knight endgame. So an absolutely stunning tactic that you wouldn't think was in the position, looking at it, 6 moves ago. But all of this is actually completely forced from bishop h4. All of this is completely forced. So, yeah, this tactic was quite nice, and again, very high level tactic. The problem is that black was lured by the beauty of the tactic, and unfortunately, this isn't actually the best move. So, do you guys actually know what the best move is here? I mean, I showed you this tactic that is completely sound, wins a pawn, but it's not actually the best. So do you guys actually know what the best is? Okay, so yeah, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, but now what? But now what? Yeah, you're right, it's rook takes d1, but what's the point of this move? There's a specific point. Yeah, so the point is you actually want to play this move queen to a5. And the idea is you just want to win this pawn. It's rather simple, but the idea is it's actually impossible for white to save this pawn. The idea is black's going to play knight b4 and queen takes a2. And the difference is in the game, black was able to get this pawn. But in this variation, black's able to get this pawn on a2. And why is getting a2 better than f4? Why is a2 better than f4? Well, it's because it's much easier to create a passed pawn when it's 2 versus 1 than when it's 4 versus 3. Moreover, the 2 versus 1 is an outside passed pawn. So an outside passed pawn is more important than a passed pawn where it's on the same side of the board as the king. It's a very subtle point. And I'm sure if Kamsky had realized that this was an alternative, he would have preferred this. But sometimes you're lured by the beauty of your own combination, and you're like, well, I win a pawn, and it's so pretty. It must be good, and it was good. It was good. It was actually great. The only thing that mars it is that there was actually something even better. So yeah, this is an important point in general, that a queenside pawn majority when the kings are castled on the king side is an outside pawn majority, and so it's often faster. So, okay, well, let's go back to see what happened, because we'll still see some insanity yet. So he did play the tactic that I mentioned. He did play this.
Check.
Okay, so he gets his endgame by force. So this is actually still really good for black. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it does pose more problems, technically, because it's kind of hard to make progress here. And you'll see what I mean once we go forward a few moves. So king e3, knight c6 hitting this. Knight d3, only way to defend it, really. a5. a4, b4. Okay. So now, the queen side's locked up. So the question is, what should white do here? What should white do here? Because it seems in a way that he's in zugzwang, right? Like, okay, if he moves his king, then knight d4 and knight takes b3 is a problem. If he moves his knight, then knight takes e5 is a problem. So, well, what should white do here? What should white do here? Oh, let me just go back quickly and answer that question about rook takes d1, knight takes d1. Yeah, so if knight takes d1 here, oops, no, I guess let me go back to this position. Right, yeah, if knight takes d1 here, yeah, the problem is this move is very strong, g5. And after f takes g5, the point is I have this queen c1 idea with the threat of queen f4 mate. So you have to go like queen f3 or something, and then I go queen d2, and all of a sudden, like, your pieces are in trouble. Bishop f2, I take on g5, and your king's in trouble, and my pieces are dominating. This knight is stuck on this square. So by playing queen takes d1, you don't really allow that, because notice that the queen still has no entry points. So by taking with a knight, my queen has its entry point on c1. That's why. So anyway, let me get to this position again. Okay, so yeah, what should white do here? Because yeah, like I said, it does seem like he's in zugzwang here. So actually, white has something very clever here. Very clever. Believe it or not, he can simply play knight to e1. Looks weird, right? But the idea is he wants to be able to shuffle between these two squares. So he wants to get his knight here. Oops, to f3. Okay, so knight e1. And the question now is, why can't black do this? Hopefully you guys can figure it out, but I'll show you if you can't. But why is knight takes pawn bad? Well, the problem is it lets the king in. So, for example, if knight takes pawn, king d4, you have to stop king c5. You have to stop king c5. So you have to play knight d7. And now king c4, king f8, king b5, king e7, king a5, king d6, king b4, e5. And all of a sudden, you know, maybe white's better here. Maybe white's better. But certainly black has kind of lost whatever edge he had because you let the king in. So this little knight maneuvering would have allowed white to kind of maintain maximum resistance. But instead he played king f4. And now h6, keeping king f g5, h4, king f7, knight c5, king e7, knight b7 hitting a5, king f8, knight c5 hitting e6, king f7, knight b7 offering a draw, king e7, knight c5, knight d8. Okay. So now, stopping knight b7. And again, if black moves his king, he's going to play g5 and then try to win this pawn. So white has to make a move that that answers these questions. So white plays g4. And f takes, king takes, knight f7 hitting this pawn. King f4, g5.
Check.
Take, and king e4. So he needs to keep on this pawn. but black's made progress now because he's created a pass pawn himself. So the fact that this pawn on e5 was isolated meant that white kind of had to go into contortions to try to save it, and black was able to make progress. So black is definitely making progress. So knight d8, king d3, knight c6, hitting this. Now white basically bails out and tries to win this pawn, but it shouldn't really work. So his relative best is to play knight e4, and then after here to play king d4 and try to get this way. But and try to take this pawn, but this is still probably hopeless. So, you know, if black plays knight d7, then you take on g5, and if black plays knight f3, then you go king c5. But again, this is still hopeless. Okay, so king c4, check. Knight e5, king b5. Okay. So king f6, knight e4, king f5, check. Knight d3, king f4, knight f1. Only way to really stop this pawn. Now g4, king a5. Okay. So in this position, it's black to move and win. Black to move and win. Does anyone know what black should do here? Anyone know what black should do here? So knight d3 actually is just a draw. So I'll just play king b5 and a5, a6, a7. So it's just a draw. And g3 is just a draw too. And king f3 is also just a draw. King f3 is also just a draw. For example, king f3, king b5, knight d7, a5, knight b8, king b6, king f2, knight d2, threatening this check, king e2, knight e4, king d3, knight g3, king c3, king b7, knight here, king c7, and chase the knight around forever. Check. That's a draw. Okay, so what should black do? Only one move wins. Only one move wins. And the move is the paradoxical knight to d7. So the idea is simply that after king takes b4, g3, king takes knight takes g3, king takes g3, king c4, e5, a5, e4, a6, e3, a7, knight b6, check. King c5, knight a8, king c6, e2, king b7, queen, king takes. So normally this is a draw, right? Normally this position's a draw. Queen against rook pawn on the 7th is a draw, but there's a slight difference. It's the addition of this pawn. So this is actually a forced mate. So after king a8, queen e8 check, king b7, queen b5 check, and now black's either going to win this pawn or mate. So for example, if king a8, now queen b6, stalemate, except b4, and then queen c7, stalemate, except b5, and then mate. Checkmate. So the addition of this extra pawn means that this endgame is actually a win. And all of that was forced, by the way. All of that was forced. So that queen and rook pawn again ending actually wins. But no other move wins. Knight c6 doesn't win, just king b5. G3 doesn't win because I can take, and then you don't get that tempo to play knight d7 to b6 to a8. Okay, so Kamsky played knight f3, which was also a good try, but now it's actually a draw. So king takes. So actually Kamsky could try the cute knight h2 here, with the idea that if knight takes h2, g3, actually this pawn promotes by force. If knight f1, then g2, the tricky fork. And if a5, of course, this is way too slow. Queen gets there in plenty of time. But after knight h2, of course, white simply plays a5, and then knight takes f1, a6, g3, a7, g2, queen, queen. And this is probably a draw. This is probably a draw. It's hard for the king to avoid a perpetual without losing this pawn. And then the queen and pawn versus queen and knight should be a draw. Okay. But instead he did knight d2. Same idea, basically. So again, if knight takes now, you get g3, g2, g1. So knight takes d2 obviously is a mistake, but a5, knight takes f1, a6. So again, black can go into g3, a7, g2, queen, queen with a draw, most likely. But Kamsky actually chose to do it a different way with knight e3. So now he's trying to get back to a8 in time. So a7, knight d5, king c5, knight c7. This is all forced. King c6, knight a8, forced. And now g3, g2, queen, queen. Okay. So now here, 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 here. Okay. So this is still a draw. This is still a draw, actually. Amazingly enough. It doesn't actually look like it's a draw, because you would think, like, you know, the king can get here and stop this pawn, and this pawn can go. But there's actually a very problem-like draw here that's based on that ready problem, where the king can actually simultaneously threaten two things at once. So if you just kind of brute force it and just try to push your pawn, e5, b4, e4, b5, e3, b6, e2, b7, queen, queen, check. Obviously this is a draw. So you can't just push your pawn. But you can try getting your king in front of this pawn and then push your pawn. So king e5 and king d5. But now, white to move and draw. You have to be careful. Be careful. For example, like b5 just loses to king c5. Because now this pawn just queens. So king b7, take, king c7, e5 not in time. Okay, how does white draw here? It looks dire. It looks dire. So how does white draw here? So yeah, the paradoxical king to b7. Paradoxical king to b7. So yeah, if king a7, you have to be careful. Because now king c4, if king b6, e5, king c6, e4, b5, e3, b6, e2, b7, e7, queen. And yeah, this is also a draw. But yeah, king b7 is much clearer. So now e5 and now b5. And now there's a dual threat. So if king c5, yeah, the e4. And then so yeah, if king c4, oops. So yeah, if king c4, then king c6. And now the dual threat. So you're threatening to do this, and you're also threatening to do this. So if king takes, king here, and it's a draw. And if e5, b5, e4, b6, e3, b7, e2, queen, and queen, and this is still a draw. So what black did instead was played e5, and then e4, and then e3, and then e2, and they agreed to a draw. Because after queen a5, queen a7, queen takes, king takes. Nothing left but the kings.